We will divide the piece up into some smaller chunks, into manageable chunks. And you know what? For just a moment, I'm going to act like this piece has 36 measures. So it turns out this piece breaks down pretty easily into 3 groups, all of which have 12 measures. Hi, this is Brett with Piano Aha. This is the first in a set of 2 videos where we want to learn to memorize the piece and to play it more musically. And we'll do it this way. In the first video, we will divide the piece up into some smaller chunks, into manageable chunks. And in the next video, we'll talk about how to use that structure to memorize the piece and play it more musically. Let me show you what I mean. So we have the sheet music here in front of us. What we want to do is break this piece down into some smaller chunks that are manageable. We see that this piece has 35 measures. And you know what? For just a moment, I'm going to act like this piece has 36 measures. I'll explain myself later. So it turns out this piece breaks down pretty easily into 3 groups, all of which have 12 measures. In other words, starting at the beginning until right before measure 12, and then starting at measure 12 up to shortly before measure 24, and measure 24 to the end. Those are our 3 big groups. But what we want to do now is to break down these groups of 12 into still smaller chunks. So let's talk about for a moment how long most musical phrases are. So in this Western music that we're talking about here, most phrases are of length 4 or 8 or 2 or 16, 32, something like that. In other words, a power of 2. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc. Anytime you're grouping musical phrases together, you're going to end up with a lot of 4s and 8s, etc. So what we want to do now is just think for a moment, what are the different ways that we could put the numbers 8 and 4 together in order to get a 12? Just for some fun, just for a moment, and it'll turn out to work very well with this piece. Now, one thing we could do is we could add, to get the number 12, we could add 4 plus 8, right? We could also add 8 plus 4. Are there any other ways? Yeah, we could add 4 plus 4 plus 4, right? Those are actually the only possibilities for using the numbers 4 and 8 to add up to 12. And it turns out those are the exact 3 possibilities that we need for this piece. The piece begins with a group of 4, and then a group of 8. And then we have a group of 8, and then a group of 4. And at the end, we have 3 groups of 4. Now, in case it seems to you like these are just made up numbers, I should show you that this is actually a representation of what happens in the music. So I said it starts here with 4 measures, the 4 measure group. So let's listen to that. You can hear I start, let's say, at home, I go out for a walk, and I come back home. So this piece does actually start with a 4 measure group, and then we have our 8 measure group. Now, this is actually a 7 measure group. So let's just act for now as if it were an 8 measure group. It's okay, I'll come back and explain that. But you hear again that where we end up at the end, if I start here, is at a point of rest, right? So that's why that gives us this group. The next group sounds like this, and again, this is going to be an 8 measure group. Again, a point of rest. You can see that that was this 8 measure group here. Now we have a sort of a transitional 4-measure group. And starting here, we only have the note G for a long time. So that's going to be this last group here. We have a 4-measure group. The important thing to think about here is this accord resolving, because the next group we have is just an echo basically of this 4-measure group. That same chord resolving. So in other words, we had 2 4-measure groups, and now we have the end. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you see none of these groups is just made out of thin air, that they actually reflect what's going on in the music. But these 8-measure groups, I would say, still need to be broken down in order to become manageable. Now we talked about before, musical phrasings usually 8 measures or 4 or 2, something like that. It turns out we can break up all of these 8-measure groups into 2 plus 2 plus 4. Also the second one is 2 plus 2 plus 4. Let me show you what you mean. Well, I'll start with this second group here. That starts here in measure 12. Why do I call this a 2-measure group? Right, because this is the 2 measures get played, and then we just basically have an echo of that, right? We have this here. So those are our 2-measure groups, and then we have a 4-measure group. So that explains this. Now let's look at this, and we're getting closer and closer to this crossed out 35 here. Let's look at this 4-measure group here at the end. Turns out to be the same 4-measure group we had here, just transposed in a different key. So that means we would start here. Right, so that's definitely clearly a 4-measure group. And I can write in these here that we talked about before. So the only 2 we need to talk about now are these 2 groups of 2. So let me start here. And again, we see that it's just a 2-measure group doing the same thing. This thing just gets echoed basically by this here. Dum, 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 dum. But the problem is this measure here gets used twice. It's sort of overlapped. So I'm going to do this in a different color here. I'm going to say this group here goes to here, and this measure, this goes to here. Right, we have our, if we start at the pink, we have this 2-measure group, and then we have this 2-measure group, and then this measure gets used twice. 1, 2, 3, 4. So how can you think about this? Why is that getting used twice? You can think of it like this. If I have a sentence, for example, I like pianos, and then I can say, pianos are nice. I like pianos, pianos are nice. I could also do a variation of that and say, I like pianos are nice, right? Where I'm just using that one word twice. Sometimes that's called dovetailing. And that is exactly what's happening here. So if you think of this as 2 plus 2 plus 4, then it makes the whole piece make sense, being 12 plus 12 plus 12, as opposed to having a 35 and a bunch of exceptions here. So it's easier to think of it as being 36 measures with an exception, rather than 35 measures with a bunch of questions here. So anyway, that's the structure that we have divided this piece into. In the next video, we'll talk about how to use this structure to memorize the piece and play it more musically. See you there.